Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for inviting me, and to all of you for being here. It's actually really great to have that tea beforehand to hear about what people are working on and sort of where they are in their academic journey. So I can tailor the talk a little bit, hopefully to your interests. If anyone has any questions, feel free to interrupt as I go. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for questions, but by all means, it is such a treat to be able to talk about my book, Do It Yourself Democracy, and I'm going to talk a bit about sort of my journey to the book, especially since there are grad students there. I think sometimes it can help to hear that, and then I'm going to talk about some of the findings, talk a little bit about sort of moving forward what the field is facing in 2020. And then finally talk a little bit about where my research has gone since the book. So just to get started, to tell you about my journey to this book, I'm actually down at the bottom, you can see my edited volume with Mike McQuarrie and Ed Walker. And we're on the same journey as grad students in the early 2000s, and had just met each other at conferences and were interested in the same issues, which were this explosion of this different kind of participation, a new kind of for lack of a better word, public engagement or civic engagement that was moving from this picture on the left, which is a San Diego City Council meeting, that's sort of 2 minutes at a microphone with decision makers on a dais, to something that had people at round tables, that had people, actually talking to each other, not just spouting, or screaming even, from a podium at some, administrators, with, everyone just sort of sick and tired at the end of the meeting. And so Mike and Ed and I were really interested in how this was happening across a lot of different fields. So Mike studies community development organizations, and Ed studies public affairs consultants, or otherwise known as grassroots lobbyists. And we were observing this across this wide variety of fields. And at the same time, in the early 2000s, all of these kinds of inequalities that, are even starker now that, Nicole talks about in her book, that, were becoming very obvious that was happening at the same time. And so we were curious about the relationship between those trends, and not necessarily that, the expansion of participation is causing inequality, but, that it might be reinforcing certain types of inequalities. And that, it might be a solution for those kinds of inequalities. So just to sort of explore the different ways that happened in a really wide array of institutional settings. So, in that book, we have people studying patient activist movements, where disease activists start their own drug companies, and then, lobby Congress for funding as, victims of the disease, and sort of, well, they're also investors. So sort of how does this sort of revolution in participation intersect with a lot of other trends going on at the same time? And so, now I frame myself as a sociologist who studies the intersection of social movements, business, and democracy. But just to give you a sense, when I started out, I was an environmental sociologist. So my dissertation was not do-it-yourself democracy. My dissertation was a comparative study of collaborative environmental planning for wetland conservation at 3 different sites in the US. And I was interested in the kinds of collaborative environmental planning that you guys are familiar with, having been written about in the developed world, new kinds of experiments. And I was looking at that in San Diego, which was where I was in grad school, was one of my sites. And they had a really model process for bringing a lot of different stakeholders to the table to stop suing each other, to start talking, and to do some more thoughtful decision making about where development was going to happen, and where San Diego is a very fragile and very important ecological area. So where conservation was going to happen. And as I was doing that project, I was realizing that there were a lot of participants in that model process who, for instance, were calling themselves the advocates for biodiversity, but they would be a developers front group. So people who were sort of had fake groups that didn't really have a lot of public participation behind them, but that were carrying some weight in those meetings. And at the same time, I was noticing that the administrators were increasingly using public engagement consultants to help with those processes, because it was just such a pain to manage all of these different participants. And those public engagement professionals were also on the outside criticizing the processes, et cetera. So I got really interested in this sort of context, right, where we have professionalization happening. And that's the same story, the sort of Theda Scotch-Pole story of, from membership to management of these sort of, multi-level movement groups becoming more and more professionalized, so that they're just male check groups, Sierra Club, et cetera. And that, increasingly, the usual suspects have these, who turn out for the kinds of public engagement that even these deep public engagement tend to be people with resources, et cetera. And that the kinds of smoke-filled back rooms that used to be where decision-making would happen, that wasn't really tenable anymore, but that there were a lot of people sort of claiming authenticity in this space. So Ed's work, and his book, Grassroots for Hire, came out about the same time as DIY Democracy. We were sort of working on these projects at the same time. And he studies grassroots lobbyists. So these are people who, sometimes gets called astroturfing. But in general, what Ed finds is that astroturfing is really expensive. Just finding actors, paying a bunch of actors to put on Energy Citizen t-shirts and show up, at a rally is actually way more expensive than just using coal company employees. The coal company employees are happy to put on the t-shirt and attend, right? That usually there are constituencies that can be targeted for mobilization by, for example, if we're talking about the tobacco industry, smokers' rights groups. Right. So, that there are smokers that want to protest smoking bans, et cetera. And his consultants were mobilizing those folks. And the similarities between his and my project were that he's studying consultants who are paid to mobilize a targeted segment of the public. And I was studying consultants who are paid to mobilize a cross section of the public. Right. And when I say mobilize, subsidize the participation of those people. Right. So to encourage participation across this wide cross section. So even though technically, authenticity wise, et cetera, there are really big differences between these consultants in terms of the money that you get paid, et cetera. They were doing sort of similar things in this space. And so my question was really, how is this, an institutional strategy, and in this particular historical context of the late 90s and 2000s? So sorry. Just to give some context, it's, while we talk about this kind of explosion of, demand and market for deeper participation, more substantive participation, we call this new, but the people who have studied the early 20th century forum movement know that this really isn't new at all, that deliberation has existed, dialogue and deliberation has existed for a long time. There were manuals for group discussion, there were famous facilitators, et cetera. And so this idea, that I try to get away from this kind of, oh, isn't that ironic that there's an expert for public participation? It's like, no, good dialogue and deliberation requires technical knowledge and skill, the same way that teaching does, right? We know this. Okay, so this has been around for a long time, but the forms that it's taking institutionally, starting in the 1980s, just to put a fine point on it, and moving into the 2010s, it becomes much more professionalized in the formal ways that sociologists study, where you start to have certification programs, you start to have courses, you start to have university programs in this. And the professional organizations consolidating. Okay. At the same time, there is this market. So the people who are taking dialogue and deliberation seriously are increasingly, power players, right? So the IMF is interested in participatory budgeting. You see, these large corporations who are interested in doing this, often with their employees, but sometimes with their consumers. You see industry lobby groups increasingly interested in this, and also, the nonprofit and social movement sector, so Sierra Club, Girl Scouts, American Red Cross, etc., are interested in this. So you end up with what I call, I sort of titled this talk provocatively, Deliberation Inc. But you start with this field, and it's providing services. And really what I was interested in asking from the very start, because so many people at this time were studying deliberation as a normative reform, as an innovation, as a kind of real utopian intervention. And there wasn't a lot of study of like how this field worked, right? There wasn't a lot of sort of ethnographic work on the field itself. And in part that's because, researchers, when they were reading my articles, I had a very hard time getting this work published. They did not believe that this existed, right? And so I had a lot of, scholars, just say, if there are consultants, it's a tiny, it's marginal, it's not important. Most of the people doing this are people like, Fishkin, et cetera. They're academics, they've got real cred, they're doing this sort of pro bono. It's that this is not an industry. And that the sort of market for these services, that's not, a thing, basically. And so I, had to prove that this, actually was an industry. And, if it is a movement, the field itself, in my survey prefers to call itself a community of practice, right? But if it is a movement comes next, and industry, is much slower down the preferred title. But if it is a movement, it's what Francesca Paletta talks about as an awkward movement, in terms of the fact that it's sort of grass tops. Like the people involved are really sort of white collar professionals who are heading up organizations and who are trying to mobilize it. But they have this sort of, and we can talk about this as far as what's going on in 2020, they have this sort of hesitancy about promoting themselves, promoting processes, et cetera, because they're so used to this sort of neutral positioning. And here you have, the leaders of the dialogue and deliberation field in the US at the White House. They were literally invited in by the Obama White House, the Obama administration, to, participate in this sort of Office of Public Engagement, this open government initiative. And that was really this moment of success for them, although the people that ended up running that Office of Public Engagement tended to be like tech, people from the tech world, and not people from the dialogue and deliberation world. Okay, so the study started in 2006. That's right when I got my PhD and was a newly minted assistant professor at Lafayette. I started a brand new project, and I did not turn my dissertation into a book, so it is possible. But I got certified in public participation pretty early on. I did a lot of participant observation at professional conferences. And I did one really fun project. This was a collaboration that just sort of came my way, where I was the expert on America Speaks, which is the big sort of category killer organization that worked in dialogue and deliberation in the US at this time period. And America Speaks was organizing to was hired by the performing arts associations, the national nonprofit performing arts associations in the US, and that's like Opera America and Ballet America or whatever, that they were hired by those organizations to run a mobilization process using their town hall meetings, as sort of small group discussions over a series of 3 days. So everyone would participate over 3 days in one of these, and be doing conference activities as well. And then a final sort of summit where, more decision-making types of steps would be taken of performing arts professionals. So this was really a kind of best case scenario for deliberations empowerment potential, just because it took place over a longer period of time than there usually is. Everyone engaged had the, capacity, resources to participate. They knew the field really well. They were very high information. They were basically the executives of, opera organizations, et cetera, and dance theater. And so I studied that with a 13-member research team, 2 other scholars and 10 grad students. I tracked the way that practitioners were talking about these challenges on their listserv, and then finally I did this practitioner survey online with Francesca Paletta at UC Irvine to get a sense. It's a non-random survey. It's the quality of the sample is it tended to match what the demographics that were at the conferences that I was attending. And I sort of checked the demographics in different ways, but it definitely was more expansive than just the membership of NCDD or just the membership of IEP2. So in terms of my findings, in the book, as those of you know who have read the book, I talk a lot about who these public engagement facilitators are, where they came from. This was a basically totally new field. So where did they come from? That ranged from therapy to they was very diverse, to corporate America, to being a mediator, et cetera. But I talk a lot about how they kind of dealt with the challenges of being a public engagement practitioner. But later on in the book, I talk about the kind of larger findings. So I'm sort of focusing on those here for thinking about the field. The first is that deep public engagement, and again, people who were skeptical of my work at the beginning wanted to sort of differ on the idea that what I was studying wasn't really deliberation, or it wasn't good deliberation if it was, achieving these. But really, this is just about describing where people were working. What were the projects that people were actually working on? What percentage, of work that they were doing was on urban redevelopment? What percentage was on restructuring? What percentage was on youth issues? And so what I found was that in general, it tended to be used in the time that I was doing this project for retrenchment, for administrative cost cutting that local governments were doing, for redevelopment. So for urban redevelopment of, Rust Belt areas, or of post crisis areas. So like, for example, after the redevelopment of Ground Zero in Manhattan, after 9/11. And then finally, corporate restructuring. So, corporations were bringing in dialogue and deliberation consultants when they had already done a round of cost cutting, or when they had just laid off a lot of staff. So you can see here some examples of this. Community prioritization when you have limited resources and unlimited expectations, right? When demand is high to participate, but or to have services, but the resources are limited. This is tough choices on healthcare. This was an America Speaks process in Maine that engage people's support in creating change in Maine's healthcare system, and it puts everyone in charge of reform. One of the things that I find, and this is a picture on the left of, actually in both of these pictures are, of America Speaks, big processes of dialogue and deliberation over, for example, Hurricane Katrina survivors, getting together and talking about what they wanted to see in their city. And I found that basically the public engagement, and the practitioners really complained about this a lot. They get brought in when contention is already occurring, or when it's at least anticipated. So they get brought in kind of too late. They always wish that they had been brought in earlier. Because prior bad planning processes have like really pissed people off. And in the case of Hurricane Katrina, you had a lot of duplicative, multiple processes going on, run by the mayor, et cetera, that people were really annoyed. They had really wanted to participate because they felt like a lot was at stake. But these had been sort of stopgap processes, and finally the foundations and sponsors kind of came in and hired America Speaks to do something more ambitious. Okay, so, in these cases, what I find is that the sponsors, and that's often, for example, the city of New Orleans or something like that, that their reputational legitimacy was already compromised. So here you see, trainings for facilitators who, that start to be more and more about public anger, that there's just, people are so mad that it's very hard to actually have meaningful discussions because they just are fuming, right? So here are just some examples from the websites of consultants, which are, talk about, you don't want the gripe session with a few grandstanders, and that's certainly the case. I mean, this is something that is the point of moving away from these 2 minutes at a microphone kind of meetings where you have these professional participants who are the usual suspects, right? That in general you're using dialogue and deliberation to get that sort of vast middle that doesn't usually participate. But here you see, you keep your session dynamic and interactive while maintaining control and yielding positive results. And this language of positivity comes a lot from appreciative inquiry, but it's very pervasive. So foster cooperation, help people work together to agree to positive actions. So what I argue is that deep engagement induces alignment. This is the language that typically got used, was it helps the employees or the customers or the citizens get better aligned with administrators' priorities or realities. Positive attitudes towards change, empathy for administrators, and this is really critical, right? That the administrators, dealing with retrenchment, et cetera, are cutting. Do you want to cut the program for the kids' school lunches, or do you want to cut the meals for the elderly folks who are institutionalized? Like, just these horrible choices. And so by sort of in these cases, giving deliberators a chance to sort of see that every decision, every desire that they had consequences where maybe we couldn't allocate as much money to something else, made them feel more empathy for these administrators that had tough choices, right? Where you see that language. But you also see a focus on individual action. So for instance, there was a big effort called Shaping America's Youth about dealing with childhood obesity, where it's sponsored by a lot of like agribusiness companies, sort of Reebok or Nike or one of the sort of athletic companies. And one of the solutions that came out of that was really sort of predominant was that you could exercise more with your family, right? That you and your kids could exercise more, that you could take those individual actions. And often these kinds of results get highlighted by deliberative consultants, like, oh, people agreed to, they, in cases where urban areas have had to retrench and can't afford to keep the street lights on anymore, the people on this street banded together and decided to, they would pay to keep the street lights on, right? So this sort of focus on individual action. And here, appreciative inquiry heightens energy, sharpens vision, and inspires action for change without resistance. And this is really where someone mentioned my Democracy's New Discipline piece, that there really was a sort of disciplinary component, even in, and this is really important, these were very authentic processes where people were angry. People are, venting a lot. They, they have the chance to deliberate. Sometimes activists are sort of incorporated into them. The consultants that I looked at were not, enthralled to the people who were, to the people who were hiring them, right? That they weren't, they had a real, sort of fidelity to the public and to wanting to represent their interests, in all of their diversity. So, that this was happening in these processes, even though these processes really were authentic. And it was that authenticity that was valuable to the clients, right? That was why the clients were hiring the public engagement consultants, was because they could really, put on a process that was going to, get buy-in from people where the sponsor just didn't have that kind of legitimacy anymore. So here's an example from a report called Democracy Pays, which has intensive information. This is from the UK. Intensive information-based democratic engagement could enable councils to pluck more feathers with less squawking, right? And here you see in Philadelphia in 2009, the city budget, tight times, tough choices. And you know, that's they always have these tough choices sort of language. There's the Wailing Wall, where people can you know, address their grievances, sort of get seen, have their concerns seen, and you know, have this kind of empathy for these hard choices that administrators make. And if you think about it, I mean, you know, I've been a subject of these kinds of things, right? Where we have to cut your healthcare. There's you guys may not be familiar with this, but it's a constant sort of like, you get surveyed, but you know, in this case for dialogue and deliberation, they want you to sort of sit with other people and discuss it. We have to cut some things. Would you rather cut, you know, your prescriptions, or would you rather cut your, you know, the copay for doctor visits? And so, you know, making these things hurt a little less is not a bad goal, right? That you know, you can, you know, you can certainly have people make choices about, you know, decisions that really impact them a lot in these cases of retrenchment. Here's my, just a taste from the D&D Practitioner Survey. I urge you guys to go to this website, and all of our results are up. These are the results for the US participants, but all of the results are up for the full sample. And here you see the sort of evangelicalism of these practitioners. So many people who don't currently support D&D would change their minds if they could just experience a single amazing D&D experience. They would become, you know, true believers. And then, and so I talk a lot about that kind of almost religious belief in deliberation in my book. But here's another case where there wasn't a lot of hostility to corporations using these processes, so with employees or customers. So 97% of the people, the practitioners, volunteers and professionals in the U.S. Said that that was good for the field of dialogue and deliberation. And you know, if you dig further, I understood that result because corporations were willing to pay a lot more than your average government, and they were willing to, you know, sort of buy in, right, to sort of try to understand what dialogue and deliberation was about. They tended to be much better clients than public administrators, right? And so you know, better clients in terms of really wanting to do a good process and you know, have success that way. So I heard that a lot from practitioners. Okay, in terms of the challenges that we're facing the field, you know, as you can see from what I've been talking about before, the concerns post 2008 in the United States are you know, really about financial crisis and how to move forward on that. On the one hand, you know, when I started studying this, folks, it was like, we've got this great remedy, how can we sell it to people? And then all of a sudden they were the most popular people in the world in 2009, right? So their processes got popular and they you know, were starting to get attention. At the same time, PR firms were moving in to that territory. So you can see this is from you know, a global PR firm that's saying, you know, we have public engagement experts, use us for your urban planning or transportation projects. And so you start to see firms that are more traditionally focused on public relations move into this space, which is a challenge for democracy practitioners, and especially in the case of and this is what I've worked with Laurence Barrère on this a little bit, in countries where public engagement, where deeper public engagement has been mandated, you see a lot of this kind of competition from major PR firms. Okay. At the same time, you know, increasing institutionalization and diffusion of these processes brings a lot of challenges. So you start to see in the 2010s, Tomorrow's Europe was 2007, but you start to see, you know, as the 2000s, you know, get to the end and then into the 2010s, you start to see this sort of institutionalization, the open government initiative, et cetera. You start to see participatory budgeting everywhere, right? That this moves from Porto Alegre. And as I am sure a lot of you know, John Paolo Baiocchi and Ernesto Ganuza have studied this kind of extension of participatory budgeting and the ways in which this sort of deeper kind of radical empowerment that was at stake in Porto Alegre just was not exported in the same way to at least the US, to other sites. And so the kinds of examples that you see in the US often are that, okay, we'll have the public housing residents do participatory budgeting, and they can decide on $2,000 worth of the budget, right? Of a sort of $50,000 or $100,000 budget. So that the sort of stakes are much lower. It's not a comprehensive, like, they get to decide the budget. They get to decide the little piece of it that might go towards helping parks and stuff like that. At the same time, and this is something I focus on because it's an ethnography of the actual practitioners, there's a lot of concern about the reception of dialogue and deliberation. The field is not very diverse. My practitioners that, in the survey, they were older, they were white, they were educated, and they were very liberal. And so they weren't really able to speak to, a particularly diverse audience. There was also, in terms of when I was studying this and specifically speaking to, this kind of idea that if people experience one great process, people were starting to get used to have experienced this in their workplaces, or in, to have had this experience a couple of times of, deeper public engagement. I have all my friends from college always tell me about, the times that they've done this at work, et cetera. But it starts to get stereotyped in negative ways. So, for example, there's been a lot of research on gender in dialogue and deliberation and turn taking, so that in good D&D, the women actually seem to take turns more often than men. But what I was finding was people talking about how deliberation was really being feminized, right? That the people who that men weren't really interested. It was much harder to attract men to participate in processes. They saw it as being something that was for women. The kind of stereotypical joke about Hillary Clinton's first campaign slogan, which was "Let the conversation begin," and like all of the men sort of run away. That kind of idea about conversation or deep conversation is somehow too feminized. At the same time, similar phenomenon with marginalized communities, the sense that dialogue and deliberation is for marginalized groups and that it's not really for white people. Right. And so you start to see that in these kinds of urban planning processes, that practitioners were having a harder time actually, getting white men to participate. So those are the kinds of sort of institutional context, historical context that I was interested in exploring. And this is very much something that's facing practitioners now. I see a lot of, I've of course stayed on all of these listservs, and you see a lot of talk about what is needed right now. COVID-19 is dialogue and deliberation. It is public engagement in the planning for these really complex decisions. That this is a perfect test case, and you see a lot of sort of, this is our moment, but how do we, take advantage of it, right? That there's not really a clear sort of mobilization piece here, where the field can really like latch onto this moment and propose its solution in an effective way. I just want to quickly scan over to just thinking about, when I began this, I would have, killed to be at the center and have this amazing, group of people talking about this phenomenon. But as, time has gone on, there's been a lot of scholarly attention to this professionalization, and especially in lots of countries, a sort of comparative take on it. Here's Laurence's and Mario and Louis' book on professionalization of public participation. Here's Oliver Escobar, who Nubek just had on her podcast, about sort of participation professionals and institutionalizing. What are the challenges here, from the perspective of Scotland, from the perspective of different methods, making citizen panels a universal bestseller, so about sort of exporting this, et cetera. And I'm just going to end on this, which is Oliver and Stephen Alstup's handbook, which is a really interesting case of people starting to think about professionals in this context of talking about democratic innovation, right? That you know, you can't sort of talk about democratic innovations now without talking about consultants as one, you know, actor. Like there's lots of actors, there are experts, there are advocates. You know, Carolyn Hendricks and Lynn Carson were, you know, were studying this in the early 2000s, right, in Australia, that, you know, we have to be paying attention to these people and what their impact on the field, on these innovations is. And you know, I'm just going to make my pitch for studying this in a lot of different ways. So using a lot of different, you know, from philosophy and political theory to ethnography to, you know, these fine-grained process studies, et cetera. So my new research is on the growth of democracy initiatives in higher ed. So this is a little bit of a, you know, sort of left turn. And what I'm interested in here is in part how, you know, dialogue and deliberation, appreciative inquiry, you see a lot of the same, you know, touchstones here, have become really central to how higher ed justifies itself, you know, in this sort of current era of crisis. There's a real crisis in higher ed over like how to justify itself. Ballooning costs, ballooning student debt, et cetera, and that the real, you know, sort of argument being made here is that we're building citizens, right? So there's been a real national effort to do this in the U.S. of foundations, of, for instance, the Obama administration, you know, higher ed industry associations promoting community engagement processes. And so I got interested in this by really being interested in, you know, the academic piece of the dialogue and deliberation professional story, but it's kind of taken me in new direction. So I've gone a little bit over. I'm going to stop there so that we can, you know, have a conversation. Love to hear what people think.
Thank you very much.